Open a satellite map today. Zoom in on the border between Iran and Iraq, north of Basra, and you'll see long scars in the dirt, parallel lines running for kilometers, dotted with pits and berms. They're trenches, still visible from orbit decades after the last man climbed out of them. 8 years of war dug them. Up to 1 million people died in them. And when it ended in August 1988, the border sat exactly where it had been in September 1980. Not roughly, exactly, the same line. So why were Iran and Iraq fighting at all? 8 years, 2 national economies burned to the ground, and not 1 meter of ground changed hands. That's the anomaly, and I want you to hold on to it, because everything in this video circles back to it. If nobody gained anything, why did it take 8 years to stop? Because a war this pointless should have collapsed under its own weight in a year. This one didn't. Something kept feeding it. It brought poison gas back to a battlefield on a scale not seen since 1918. It pulled in the United States, the Soviet Union, Israel, France, Britain, China, and half the Arab world. And when you follow the paper trail, the shipping manifests, the declassified cables, the arms invoices, you find that the answer isn't inside Iran or Iraq at all. Let's start with the man who lit the match and what he thought he was buying. To understand why Saddam Hussein invaded Iran in September 1980, you have to understand that he was not, in his own mind, starting a war. He was conducting a police action. In February 1979, the Iranian Revolution had swept away the Shah, the closest American ally in the region and the strongest military power in the Gulf. What replaced him was a Shia clerical government under Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and that government did not think of itself as the government of Iran. It thought of itself as the beginning of something that would spread. Khomeini's people broadcast openly, in Arabic, that the Muslims of the region should rise up and remove their own rulers. They named names. Saddam heard that broadcast as a personal threat, and he wasn't being paranoid. Iraq was a country with a Shia majority, ruled by a secular Ba'athist state, drawn heavily from the Sunni minority. Khomeini himself had spent 13 years of exile living in the Iraqi holy city of Najaf, building relationships inside the Iraqi Shia clergy, until Saddam expelled him in 1978. In 1980, Iraqi Shia militants tried to assassinate the deputy prime minister, Tariq Aziz. Saddam responded by executing the senior Shia cleric, Mohammed Bakir al-Sadr, and his sister. So there's motive number 1, fear. A regime that believed a revolution was being exported directly at it. Motive number 2 was older and simpler. It was water. The Shat al-Arab is the river formed where the Tigris and Euphrates join and run down to the Gulf. It is Iraq's only real access to open sea, and the border ran down the middle of it under a deal Saddam had signed with the Shah in Algiers in 1975, a deal he signed from a position of weakness and resented every day afterward. On the 22nd of September 1980, he had it read out on television, and he tore it up on camera. Motive number 3 was oil. The Iranian province just across that border, Khuzestan, holds a large share of Iran's petroleum, and it has a substantial ethnically Arab population. Saddam's intelligence services told him those Arabs would greet Iraqi troops as liberators. And all 3 of those motives were only actionable because of a 4th thing, the belief that Iran could not fight back. That belief was based on real evidence. Under the Shah, Iran had been armed by Washington like almost nowhere else on Earth. Iran was the only country outside the United States ever permitted to buy the F-14 Tomcat, an interceptor so advanced that American officers were nervous about it leaving the country at all. Then the revolution came, and the new government looked at that military and saw the Shah's Praetorian Guard. By some counts, around 85 senior generals were executed in the first 7 months of 1979 alone, and by September 1980, roughly 12,000 officers had been purged from the armed forces. Conscripts walked away in enormous numbers. Desertion rates have been estimated as high as 60%. Spare parts had stopped arriving because Iran was in the middle of the hostage crisis and under American embargo. On paper, Saddam was invading a corpse. He gave his commanders about a month to plan it. He expected a few weeks of fighting and a signature. He got 8 years. And the first clue as to why is in what happened in the opening 90 minutes. The plan was borrowed. Saddam wanted to do what Israel had done to Egypt in 1967, destroy an enemy air force on the ground before it could take off, and then walk into the territory at leisure. On the 22nd of September, Iraqi aircraft hit 10 Iranian airfields, and almost nothing happened. The Iranian aircraft weren't parked in neat rows in the open. The Shah, with American money and American planning, had built hardened concrete shelters, and the planes were inside them. Iraqi bombs cratered runways and chewed up support buildings, but the fleet survived. Within a day, the Iranian Air Force was flying, and within a week, it was striking Iraqi oil facilities and hitting targets deep inside Iraq. On the 30th of September, Iranian Phantoms even bombed the Osirak nuclear reactor outside Baghdad, a detail worth filing away, because we'll come back to that reactor. Clue number 1. The surprise attack failed because Iran had been fortified by the same country now embargoing it. On the ground, the second assumption collapsed just as fast. Iraqi columns rolled into Khuzestan expecting an uprising and found none. Most of the Arabs of Khuzestan stayed loyal to Iran. Instead of liberators being welcomed, Iraqi armor found itself grinding through irrigation ditches, canals, and towns in exactly the kind of close terrain where tanks die. The city of Khorramshahr is the case study. Iraq needed it in days. It took more than 3 weeks of street fighting, house by house, against regular troops, Revolutionary Guards, and civilians with rifles. When it was over, the Iranians renamed it Kunanshar, the City of Blood. Iraq's advance had already lost its shape, and by early 1981, the front had essentially frozen. Then Iran started pushing back. Through 1981 and into 1982, the Iranians launched a series of counteroffensives, and in May 1982, they retook Khorramshahr and took tens of thousands of Iraqi prisoners in the process. So here's where a normal war ends. Saddam had gambled and lost. He had no territory worth keeping, an army bleeding badly, and an enemy that had found its feet. On the 20th of June 1982, he did the rational thing. He announced a ceasefire and offered to pull his forces back to the international border within 2 weeks. And that is the moment the story turns into something else, because the offer was refused. Khomeini's answer was that there would be no peace with the Ba'ath government at all. Iran would fight on until the regime in Baghdad was replaced, and it wanted reparations on top. Iranian forces crossed into Iraq in July 1982, heading for Basra, which gives us a very clean working theory, and it's the theory most people carry around. Saddam started the war, but Iran is the reason it lasted. Because in 1982, Iran turned down peace out of religious fanaticism. That theory is tidy. It is also wrong, and the evidence that breaks it is sitting in an Israeli shipping ledger. If the war was a straightforward fight between a secular Arab dictatorship and a Shia theocracy, then the alliances should have been simple. They were not simple. They were, frankly, deranged. Start with Israel. Iraq was one of Israel's most committed enemies. Iraqi units had fought in the wars of 1948, 1967, and 1973. Baghdad had never signed an armistice. And Israel spent the Iran-Iraq War arming Iran, not as a rumor, as a logistics operation. It began within months of the revolution, an early shipment of tires for Iranian F-4 Phantoms in 1980, then tank parts, then artillery shells in every caliber the Iranians were running short of, then TOW anti-tank missiles, Hawk components, tens of thousands of Uzi submachine guns, and, crucially, spare parts to keep those American-built F-14s and F-4s in the air. One 1981 operation alone moved an estimated $75 million in materiel out of Israeli stockpiles. Israeli technicians worked on Iranian aircraft. By the mid-80s, the traffic was running through chartered cargo ships in a broker's office in Cyprus, and estimates of the annual value run from the hundreds of millions into the billions. Why? Because Israeli planners had a cold rule. The immediate danger is the enemy on your border, with a real army and a nuclear program. And in 1981, that was Iraq. On the 7th of June 1981, Israeli F-16s flew across Saudi and Jordanian airspace and destroyed the Osirak reactor, the same reactor Iranian jets had damaged 8 months earlier. Iran and Israel, without coordination and without acknowledging each other, bombed the same building for the same reason. Now the superpowers, where it gets worse. The Soviet Union had been Iraq's principal arms supplier for years. When Saddam invaded, Moscow was annoyed enough to suspend deliveries. Iraq had gone to war without asking. That embargo lasted until roughly 1982, and then, as Iran began advancing into Iraqi territory and Moscow reconsidered its interests, the weapons started moving again, in volume. The United States is the ugly part. Washington had every reason to hate Tehran after the embassy hostage crisis, and it tilted hard toward Baghdad. Iraq was quietly taken off the American list of state sponsors of terrorism in 1982. In June of that year, Reagan signed a directive committing the United States to doing what was necessary to prevent an Iraqi defeat. American satellite and radar intelligence on Iranian troop movements flowed to Iraqi commanders. American and West German firms sold Iraq the dual-use chemical precursors and equipment that fed its chemical weapons program, pesticide plants in the paperwork. Washington also ran a diplomatic campaign, Operation Staunch, pressuring other countries not to sell weapons to Iran. And while that campaign was running, the same administration was secretly selling weapons to Iran. That's Iran-Contra. Hawk and TOW missiles moved to Tehran, partly through Israel, in exchange for help freeing American hostages in Lebanon, with the profits diverted to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. When a Lebanese magazine broke the story in November 1986, the American strategy in the Gulf was exposed as two contradictory policies running in the same building. So look at what we actually have. Iraq is receiving Soviet weapons and American intelligence at the same time. Iran is receiving Israeli weapons and, secretly, American missiles. Iraq's Arab financiers, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait above all, are pouring tens of billions of dollars into Baghdad. France is selling Iraq aircraft and Exocet missiles. China is selling to both. This is the point where the simple theory dies. This was not two countries fighting each other. It was two countries being kept upright by outsiders, none of whom wanted either side to win. An American official later summarized the policy in a line that has followed him ever since. It's a pity they can't both lose. But one detail still didn't add up. Foreign weapons explain how the war stayed supplied. They don't explain how it stayed manned. By 1983, both armies were being fed into a static front that killed men faster than any modern state should tolerate. Somebody had to keep walking into it. So who was doing the dying, and why did nobody stop it? Iran had a manpower problem with an unusual shape. It had people. It had lost the officers who knew how to use them. The solution was the Besiege, a volunteer mobilization founded in the first weeks of the war, feeding the Revolutionary Guard with men and boys recruited out of mosques and schools. The units included members as young as 12 and as old as 70. Training was short, equipment was thin. What they were given instead was religious framing, martyrdom, the promise of paradise, and a narrative that put them inside the founding story of Shia Islam. What they were used for was terrain. Sent forward in mass infantry assaults ahead of or alongside regular forces, they absorbed fire, crossed minefields, and located Iraqi positions. Western journalists called it the human wave, and historians still argue about how literally to take that phrase. The tactics were more varied than the legend, but the outcome isn't in dispute. Iranian offensives in the mid-80s produced casualty figures that belonged to the First World War, and the front barely moved. Iraq's answer was to stop attacking and start engineering. Saddam's army dug in and built one of the densest defensive systems anywhere in the late 20th century. Layered trench lines, sand berms, concrete bunkers, dense minefields, wire, and artillery registered on every approach. Around Basra, the Iraqis flooded the ground and deepened it into an artificial lake, so that any assault had to come through water under observed fire. Those are the scars still visible on satellite imagery today. And where earthworks weren't enough, Iraq used gas. It began early and small. The first probable Iraqi chemical attack came in the fighting around Susangerd in 1980, and then it scaled into doctrine. Mustard gas to contaminate ground and burn lungs and skin. Nerve agents, tabun and later sarin, delivered by artillery and aircraft against troop concentrations. Iranian field hospitals filled with blistered, blinded men. And Iran shipped some of the worst cases to European hospitals, specifically so that Western doctors and journalists would document what had been done to them. It worked. The world looked at the evidence and did essentially nothing. UN investigators confirmed chemical weapons use. The Security Council issued statements that avoided naming Iraq as the party responsible for years. No sanctions followed that mattered. Baghdad drew the obvious conclusion. The cost of using nerve agents on human beings was zero. The fighting in the marshes gives you the texture of the thing. In 1984, Iranian forces attacked through the wetlands north of Basra in boats and on foot, wading in chest-deep water. Among the Iraqi countermeasures was electricity. Cables run into the water and charged from generators so that a man moving through the reeds could be killed by the marsh itself. Combine that with helicopter gunships firing into open water and gas shells landing in the reeds, and you have the worst battlefield of the late 20th century. By the mid-80s, both governments understood that the ground war was not going to resolve anything. So they changed target. They started bombing each other's civilians. The War of the Cities ran in 5 separate campaigns over the course of the conflict, and the last one, in early 1988, was the worst. Iraq had taken Soviet Scud missiles and rebuilt them, cutting them apart, extending the fuel tank, cutting the warhead down, to produce the Al Hussein, a missile with enough range to reach Tehran. In that final campaign, Iraq fired more than 500 ballistic missiles at Iran, and over 400 landed on 27 cities. Tehran alone was hit by 118 missiles across 52 days, killing over 400 civilians and wounding more than 1,500. Hundreds of thousands of people left the capital. Iran fired back at Baghdad with what it had, which was less. Then they went after money. Iraq began attacking tankers loading at Iran's oil terminals, trying to cut the revenue that paid for the war. Iran couldn't easily hit Iraq's exports. Iraq was shipping through pipelines across Turkey and Saudi Arabia, so Iran attacked the shipping of Iraq's financiers instead, Kuwaiti and Saudi vessels moving through the Gulf. Lloyd's of London counted more than 540 commercial ships damaged over the course of the tanker war, and something like 430 civilian sailors killed. Merchant crews, most of them Asian and European, dying in a war they had no part in. And that is how the United States Navy ended up escorting Kuwaiti oil tankers reflagged as American ships beginning in 1987, protecting cargo that was, in effect, financing Saddam Hussein. The Gulf then produced 2 disasters. On the 17th of May 1987, an Iraqi aircraft fired 2 Exocet missiles into the American frigate USS Stark, killing 37 American sailors. Iraq called it a mistake, and Washington accepted the explanation. And on the 3rd of July 1988, the cruiser USS Vincennes, engaged with Iranian gunboats, mistook a scheduled Iranian airliner climbing out of Bandar Abbas for an attacking fighter and shot it down. 290 civilians died, including 66 children. Tehran did not believe it was an accident. It read the shootdown as a message. The United States was now prepared to enter the war directly. That belief is what finally ended it. The last year of the war is where every thread we've pulled comes together, and it's also where the cruelty peaks. By 1988, Iraq was, on paper, a serious military power. Years of foreign credit and foreign weapons had produced a large, better-trained army with an air force that could operate. Iran was in the opposite condition, isolated by embargo, drained by the loss of a generation of volunteers, exhausted by missiles falling on its cities, and running out of recruits. Draft dodging and desertion were rising. The besieged pipeline was drying up because families would no longer send their sons. Between April and July 1988, Iraq ran a rapid series of offensives and pushed the Iranians back out of nearly everything they had taken over 8 years, using massed artillery, armor, and chemical strikes on Iranian command posts and assembly areas. At the same time, Saddam turned the same weapons inward against Iraq's own citizens. Iraq's Kurds in the north had, in significant part, sided with Iran, and Saddam's cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, ran a campaign against them between February and September 1988 called Anfal. It proceeded in 8 phases: bombardment, chemical attacks, ground sweeps, mass arrests, executions, and the systematic destruction of the countryside. Around 1,200 Kurdish villages were wiped off the map. On the 16th of March, 1988, Iraqi aircraft dropped chemical munitions on the town of Halabja and killed several thousand people, most of them civilians, in a single afternoon. Photographs of that town, families dead in the street where they fell, became the defining image of the entire war. The death toll of Anfal is contested. Human Rights Watch, working from captured Iraqi documents, estimated between 50,000 and 100,000 killed. Kurdish organizations have put the figure as high as 182,000. Iraq's own courts, decades later, called it genocide. And that gas was the final argument in the war. Iranian leaders concluded that Iraq was now willing and able to put nerve agents on Iranian cities, and that Iran had no equivalent means of retaliation and no protector. The UN Security Council had passed Resolution 598, calling for a ceasefire and a return to the international borders back in July 1987. Iran had spent a year refusing it. On the 17th of July 1988, Iran accepted. Khomeini's public statement about that decision is one of the most quoted lines in modern Iranian history. He said that taking it was more deadly than drinking from a poisoned chalice, and that he envied those who had already died as martyrs because he had been left alive to do this. The guns went quiet at 3 a.m. on the 20th of August, 1988. So, the question from the opening: why did a war nobody could win take 8 years to stop? Now you can answer it. Not because either side was capable of winning, because neither side was ever allowed to lose. Every time Iraq began to break, foreign money and foreign weapons propped it back up. Every time Iran was cut off, a back channel opened. The one weapon that might have forced an early decision, poison gas, was used freely for years, and the international system that was supposed to punish it looked away instead. Take the outside supply lines out of this story, and the war ends in 1982, the year Saddam offered to quit. The war didn't last 8 years, despite the rest of the world. It lasted 8 years because of it. The borders were unchanged. That's the fact I opened with, and it's true. But it's also the most misleading fact about this war, because everything that came afterward was built on it. Saddam Hussein finished the war commanding a huge army and owing an estimated $80 billion, a large share of it to the Arab neighbors who had funded him, including Kuwait, which now wanted repayment and would not lower oil prices to help him earn it. 2 years after the ceasefire, in August 1990, he solved that problem the way he had tried to solve the last one. He invaded Kuwait. The Gulf War followed, then a decade of sanctions. Iran finished the war having learned a specific lesson, and it wasn't about religion. It was that it had been gassed in front of the entire world, and no one had lifted a finger. And that the answer was never to be defenseless in that way again. Every subsequent argument about Iranian missiles and Iranian nuclear ambitions traces back through those field hospitals. And in 2003, the United States went to war with Iraq over the argument that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, a program that Western companies had helped supply the ingredients for, while Western governments declined to punish him for using them. Nobody won this war. It just kept paying out to everyone for the next 30 years. If you got something out of this one, subscribe. That's the whole channel. Wars and disasters taken apart properly. No shouting, no cardboard villains. Hit the like button. It genuinely decides whether videos like this get shown to anyone. And tell me in the comments which piece of this you want a full episode on, because there's a case to be made for each: the Osirak raid, Iran-Contra, or Halabja. Next time, we're staying with the ledger and looking at another conflict where the money tells a completely different story than the history books do. There's a war you were taught ended in a treaty. It didn't. It ended when someone stopped paying for it, and I can show you the invoice.